Welcome everyone to another episode of In a Nutshell, the fortnightly podcast hosted by Natural Gas World, where we look at the global news and trends in the gas industry. My name is Joseph Murphy, and with me today is Leila Benali, Chief Economist at the International Energy Forum, which is the largest organization of energy ministers from 71 countries. Hi Leila, thanks for coming on board.
Good afternoon, Joe. How are you?
Very good, very good. So the oil and gas industry faces increasing scrutiny over emissions of methane, a far more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Methane emissions are becoming a bigger part of the global climate conversation, and we see various jurisdictions, including the EU and the US, taking steps to address them. Now, in June, the IEF launched its own methane initiative. Leila, could you walk me through what this initiative is and what it hopes to achieve?
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for the opportunity to present our initiative. I think the idea of this initiative came from, a few discussions that we were having with industry stakeholders and some member countries. But the real, I think, impetus came when I discussed it with the founders of Kairos, and we were agreeing that there is a clear absence of a widely endorsed and standardized methodology for methane emissions in the energy industry. I think there is an increase in awareness that we need to tackle emissions, especially methane emissions in the energy sectors, for reasons that we can discuss in this podcast. But I think the absence of a standardized methodology was really lacking. So that's why we partnered. The IEF partnered with Kairos, that is a leading advanced data analytics company, to really develop this methodology to accurately measure methane emissions. And one of the other issue that we wanted to tackle here is that the methane emissions that are estimated using the traditional bottom-up intensities and reporting by companies are about 90% lower than what is being observed by satellite imagery. So in a very quick nutshell, the methodology that we are proposing is combining top-down evaluations with from new satellite technologies and bottom-up estimates from company reporting, ground observations, and we have been perfecting the advanced modeling through country consultations.
Mm-hmm. And how does this differ from other initiatives like you have the oil and gas methane partnership methodology. There's also the methane guiding principles, which set standards for monitoring and addressing emissions.
Right. So I think that, the good news is that at the end of this initiative, we will be publishing a white paper where we are listing all the similar initiatives that have been developed since 2004, because there are a number of voluntary or multilateral methane-related programs. The initiative that we are leading here is different from the existing ones because we are accessing a more global and advanced data. We are pursuing a very inclusive approach where we are leveraging our network of 71 member countries, and we have also the ability to mobilize and work on methane assessments at the country and not at the corporate level. So, of course, the existing initiatives are very different. They serve different goals. So we are, in our case, and some of them are actually using satellite data that is for free, and others are on commercial basis. The initiative that we are proposing is a methodology that is using publicly available global satellite data from the European Space Agency Copernicus program, and we are pairing that with inversion model and ground level context. And we have been testing that with countries as we went through the methodology. So we really commend the work of other programs, and we really encourage our member countries to use any available and existing tools. But we also had a timing element. You mentioned the more potent nature of methane, and we also have COP26 coming soon. So we really wanted to have something available for our member countries, first to prepare their revisions their second revisions of the NDCs in preparation for COP26, and also to have something that can be available relatively quickly for the energy industry.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about how you bring together the top-down emission measurements and the bottom-up methods, and you bring them together to try and create something more accurate. So if you're just taking satellite data on its own, what are the limitations there? You mentioned that. You mentioned that reported methane emissions from the ground are about 10% of what is observed by satellite. So is there a way in which satellite data can potentially overestimate the figures? What are the limitations?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects there, Joe. And I think the fact that you mentioned the word accuracy is important, because what we are looking at here is definitely accuracy as much as possible, but more importantly, acceptance of the methodology by the various stakeholders. So we are definitely aware of the limitations of using raw satellite data only, and that's why actually we pursued this approach. I mean, when you take satellite imagery, it can be obstructed or even distorted by large bodies of water like oceans and lakes, high humidity, clouds, meteorological conditions. You have geographic abnormalities, you have temporal issues, and also the attribution. And we can discuss later on how it was difficult sometimes to discern when there is overlap with other potential sources like agriculture, like landfills for some countries, and when you have energy infrastructure overlapping in those areas. And also we have the geographic limitations. It's very difficult to accurately measure over wetlands, snow, or along the equator. And we have so many countries, actually energy producing and consuming countries that are along the equator as well. So we faced this very first hand at the beginning of our initiative, in our very first discussions with some of our member countries which were involved in the initiative, which are, for example, located alongside the equator, or they have a large offshore production. So neither top-down or bottom-up estimates are perfect on their own, but we want to reconcile the methodologies, and we want to bring in region-specific operational data, modeling, and artificial intelligence. So we think that the ultimate result should be as accurate as possible with the current technology and be acceptable. That's for me is the key word, more than accuracy. And this is exactly why we are combining these different methods. And the measurements of methane emissions in oil and gas production areas have already been made, I mean, as you know, using surface monitors and aerial approaches. But we also take into account the cost element. But these campaigns can be costly, time intensive, time consuming, and they can only provide a snapshot of emissions, potentially missing some of the super emitter episodes. So really this calls for more frequent and region-wide monitoring of emissions, taking into account the cost element for some of our member countries who don't have the means, or the oil or gas companies operating in their areas do not have the means to lead, I would say, costly monitoring campaigns.
And when you bring, obviously, the bottom-up way of quantifying emissions also has its limitations. Given the fact that all of your different members will be measuring methane emissions on the ground to different extents, right? How does that must pose a challenge to trying to come up with a kind of uniform method for quantification, no?
Yes, now indeed. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. It's been, challenging to put together a combination of approaches and come up with this, again, a standardized methodology that would be acceptable and relatively accurate for everyone. So, I mean, that's why we are finishing the draft of the white paper, where we put some additional details on the methodology. I can give you very quickly some high-level understanding of what we're trying to do in this methodology. So high-level approach, we are proposing to use satellite detection systems, and we decided with Kairos to use the European Space Agency Sentinel-5P satellite, because it's carrying already the tropomy monitoring instrument. And the satellite itself orbits the Earth 13 to 40 times per day, and it covers 95% of the surface of the Earth. So usually, I mean, traditionally, the data has been used to really reveal individual cases of unintended very large methane leaks and regional basin-wide anomalies. And that's why we want to complement that with artificial intelligence algorithms, in addition to the existing systems of aerial monitoring and ground-based surveillance, to really estimate this accurate methane emission rate. So in order to analyze and attribute, again, we get back to the cross-sector attribution of methane emissions, in order to attribute emissions to a specific energy installation of production or basin from the raw satellite data, we also consider, of course, weather conditions, wind directions, and there are also other ground factors that are considered. And Kairos has been using and perfecting during this initiative an inversion model and meteorological models that are being used as well. So basically what happens, I mean, in a nutshell, we take the raw satellite data from the Sentinel-5P imagery, we identify sub-areas within a basin. It can be oil, gas, or coal as well, in some regions like Australia and India, and we try to attribute part of the total emissions. And the combination of these simulations can explain the atmospheric concentrations of methane observed that is then retained by the model. I don't want to get too much into the details, but the regional, we take that methodology and we applied it to specific regions, and we put basically among the member countries who were involved with us in this initiative in three main buckets, if you may, or archetypes of countries and regions, and we will outline that in the white paper in more details. But we prioritize every region according to three key metrics. You have the super emitters, you have the flaring, and you have the methane intensities. And every country would have a combination of these three, or one or two out of the three, etc. And now that we're having this we're hoping that with the increasingly available and hopefully more affordable satellite technologies coming from the various initiatives that are happening at the same time, we will improve the accuracy of the output of the model. But we added to it, to this, as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, that we had the countries taking the methodology and testing it themselves, testing the numbers that we are getting and the methane intensities that we are getting themselves, with some ground truthing as well. So I think at the end of the day, once we publish the white paper in September, we will be in a position to provide much more details on the methodology and intricacy, and hopefully we will have a wider acceptance of the methodology per se. It's not perfect, of course. It really calls for additional perfection, but we are hoping that it will create some additional momentum to create that standardized approach that I've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. And what has the oil and gas industry's track record been so far in dealing with methane emissions?
I think the oil and gas industry, more specifically, I mean, we have been in tracking and trying to monetize the methane emissions. Have been doing, I would say, have been making efforts. over the last 20 years. It's just that it has been very bad in communicating around those efforts. And now when you look at the potential upcoming regulations that you have at the country or block level. I mean, you have indeed the EU methane strategy that has been published in October 2020. You have the Biden administration that has been making clear that they want new methane pollution limits to be enforced. I think there's already something there that the industry have been doing in terms of leak detection and repair efforts. And also the fact that, especially in the gas industry, it's very clear that I think there's a number that is floating in the industry that 70% of methane emissions can be mitigated and abated at zero or negative costs. So I think it's very much accepted in the industry that this is the low-hanging fruit. I think what would be great from a regulation perspective is to bring in, to link first the technologies and the incentives, to bring better technologies and data to lead to more acceptable and accurate calculations that would inform regulation and not the other way around. Because I think the industry has the tools to measure and mitigate its methane emissions. But I think what would be required at this stage, particularly post-COP26, is really an accelerated adoption of these standardized methodologies. As I said, we are proposing one. It can definitely be improved further. But I think we really have the industry and the regulators have to really start thinking in terms of standards, in terms of monetization, in terms of carrots, rather than just detection and sticks and let's detect the super emitters. And I think that's an area that we at the IEF have been watching very carefully. And I think the impact, if I take it a step further, definitely post COP26, and if I think about it in terms of 2, 3, 4 years down the road, in the case of the adoption of cross-border carbon adjustments, the impact that this would have if the industry is ready is huge in terms of energy trade. And we want to make sure, you want to make sure that we're not over penalizing or over compensating some part of oil and gas trade because of we have not implemented the tools to accurately and measure and detect carbon emissions and methane emissions. Now I'm putting everything in the same basket, if you don't mind. I think the EU has a key role to play because it's also the largest global importer of fossil fuels. But I think there's an issue of fair trade that will be dealt with in due course by the major regulators of this industry.
A few things to pick up on there. So the IEA's 2020 methane tracker, it estimated that 40% of current methane emissions could be avoided at no net cost, which is something you picked up on. So if that's the case, gas companies have so many reasons to address their emissions. They can sell the resulting gas that they save. They can improve their ESG rating. Make investors happy. If these emissions can be prevented at no cost, why haven't the companies done it already?
Well, the companies have been, I would say, monetizing methane when they could. I mean, in some areas, you still have issues of venting and flaring or accidents or leaks that constitute also still a large part of methane emissions when it comes to the energy sector per se. I mean, the other issue that we can talk about is how this compares to other sectors that are also methane intensive. But for the energy sector per se, I think there are definitely valid reasons why we should definitely put additional, not pressure, but as I said, provide more sticks to monetize as much as possible methane emissions. And it's a low-hanging fruit for three main reasons. You mentioned one. I can mention another one. I mean, it's definitely the second highest contributor to global warming after carbon dioxide, and it's more potent in the short term, as you say. So if here's a historic opportunity for the energy industry to showcase and to communicate on the tools and efforts that it has been putting in place. The issue is when it comes to reporting, because if you look at the major oil and gas industries today, the majority of them, the large majority of them, have some sort of reporting tools either in their annual report, on their sustainability report, on their methane emissions. And you also have the OGCI initiative, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, that is actually a grouping of companies, of oil and gas companies, IOCs and NOCs together, and they have come up with their own industry agreed targets when it comes to methane intensities and methane emissions as well. Now, as I said, the issue is really to take the further step of bridging that gap between the 10% and the 100% that we mentioned at the beginning of this call. The reality, the truth must be somewhere in between 50 to 60%. And that's what we have to agree on, not by providing only sticks, as I mentioned. That's where the regulator has to play a key role here, and this is where the IEF and other organizations like ourselves are coming in, because there's a clear asymmetry of information between the countries and the companies that are operating in those countries. So whatever is being reported by the companies is great. We need to get to that additional mile, and the energy sector is actually much more advanced than other sectors that are methane emitting, to bring, as I said, more accepted accuracy in what is being reported today.
So you mentioned the importance of offering the industry some carrots as well as threatening them with the stick to promote action on methane emissions. What could those carrots be?
I mean, I think you've already mentioned some of those. I mean, if you look, it really then depends on which country you're talking to and what are the national circumstances of every country and where the methane emissions are coming from. And I will encourage you to read the white paper when it's being issued, because you will see the diversity, even when it's something as that would look trivial as methane emissions in the energy sector. Once you start scratching the surface, you realize that the issue is very different from one country and actually one basin to the other. So the way the carrots, the incentives that you can give to the industry at every stage of the game really depends on where you are looking at: oil, gas, coal, whether you're looking at production, transportation, whether we are talking about pipelines, whether we're talking about cross-national pipelines that are crossing a few countries. It very much dependent on where we stand. So having, for example, a clear understanding of what a carbon price could be. I think that's the industry has been asking for some clarity on that, at least, not necessarily for a high price, but for a fair price. I think it would be quite important. Another incentive is the ability to monetize the methane, because in some countries the regulation does not allow for that at all. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, my screen went totally blank, so I could not see you anymore. So I think the the carrots or the incentives are very much there for the countries and for the companies to grab. What is required, I think, at this stage is just an additional dialogue between the countries and the companies, and I think a lack of not a suspicion. I think doing that in again, as we did, in a consultative approach, in an inclusive approach that will take into account those national and basin circumstances and industry circumstances, rather than just bring in a top-down approach with, as you mentioned, a stick.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there's disproportionate scrutiny towards methane emissions in the energy sector, and perhaps not enough focus on other major emitting sectors like agriculture, the big one?
I think yes, we run into this at the beginning of our initiative because, well, first you have indeed 60% of methane emissions that are driven by human activity, whether it's, as you mentioned, agriculture, raising livestock, rice production, landfills, waste management, and the energy sector, of course. And in many countries, I mean, there's a huge overlap between these. So I think it's the scrutiny that the energy sector is getting. I think it's valid and it's good publicity, and it's I think a historic opportunity for the energy sector to play a good role. Because it's relatively easier compared to other sectors like agriculture, where we have huge kettles dispersed over a huge land. It's very difficult to assess and measure methane emissions coming from agriculture. And I know that the agriculture industry has been making some steps in that direction. I'm just saying that the technicalities of it would be much more difficult than in the case of the energy sector, where you have, in several cases, a centralized energy infrastructure where we can very easily, relatively easily, attribute some part of the emissions to that specific infrastructure. It's easier said than done, but in general, I would say compared to the agricultural sector, it should be relatively easier. So I think it's, for the energy industry, is a golden opportunity compared to other sectors. For the other sectors, you also have, I think, some ethical issues to deal with as well. I mean, I don't want to start a debate here about whether we should continue on a protein-based diet or not, or whether we should continue eating meat or not. But I think we have some in other sectors, there are some ethical issues that are, I think, much deeper than what you would get into the energy sector, where the question is whether you want to have access to energy or not, whether you want to develop the country or not. So I think the ethical questions are a bit more complicated for other sectors than for the energy sectors.
Mm-hmm. And if we could now just talk about the energy transition in general. So the IEF represents a diverse mix of countries with different geographies, different energy mixes, different economic conditions. So when you come across net zero forecasts like that recently published by the IEA, which essentially said no further investment in oil and gas is needed if we're going down that pathway towards net zero. Do you think this is a useful recommendation, or do you think there needs to be a more kind of localized approach to how countries should move along the energy transition path?
Yeah, I think you have a number of backcasting analysis and forecasts. I mean, the IEA is not the only one. These could be useful in their own right, but I mean, the conclusions can be used totally differently by the stakeholders. So in general, we don't comment on the work of sister organizations, and we all have totally different mandates. But when it comes to the localized approach that you mentioned, we don't think about it, we actually practice it. And that's really the heart of what the IEF was created in the first place. And I think even before COVID-19 pandemic, and I think you're touching here a very important, a critical question, Joe, is the issue of what do you do with global energy governance? And I think even before the pandemic, the global energy governance was being reshaped. And at times it was even questioned. As you know, multilateralism was being questioned. We've seen shifting superpower dynamics. We've seen a rapidly growing and changing world. The pandemic has exposed some challenges much more than before. And global consensus building, I think it's quite difficult in many areas, not only in the energy sector, but in the areas of climate, in the areas of public health, all those, I would say, issues that we would think would require a global response. The issue is now, as you say, as you actually hint at, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you seem to be implying that the traditional way of thinking about global governance and requiring a global response is reaching its limits. And we think that there, if I take it down to the energy and climate question, there are three key areas that are overlooked in the current global energy governance landscape. It's a multi-trillion dollars industry sector. We have a fast-changing policy environment. We have a fast-changing financial environment. I really want to talk about investments also as well. And we have a widespread industry restructuring. The energy industry that you will get in 10 years' time, it will look totally different, I think, than the energy industry that we have today. So I think issue number one is clean energy R&D. We can talk about investments in renewables and clean energy as much as we want, but I don't think we can rely on the traditional funding models that we had before. So that's one area that we think is definitely overlooked, and we really want to enhance at the IEF the understanding of what type of technologies are available today, the new technologies that need to be really developed for tomorrow, and the funding models that will need to accompany that. We think that the policymakers have to create some additional frameworks for more diversified financing for technology R&D. Financial markets have to become more mature in many parts of the world. And I'm not talking here about the US and Europe, but again, about the 71 member countries that we have. The second area that we think is definitely overlooked in these questions is energy pricing, is domestic energy pricing transparency. It's critical to de-risk policy and to encourage investments and funding, but we want to get away from the, I would say, traditional bashing of energy subsidies, if you may, or energy incentives. And for that, I want to tackle this issue of what it would mean, how do you price your energy domestically and for your trade? And that's why I wanted to link it to my earlier point about cross-border adjustments. We think that might accelerate that if it happens, but if we can standardize how you price energy across the board, including carbon accounting, by the way, in domestic pricing and in energy trade, I think that will increase transparency. It will make it easier for policymakers to de-risk energy investments and for investors to continue to invest in the energy sector. And the last I think overlooked question is there's a huge hype about new fuels, new carriers like hydrogen, ammonia, etc. It's all very well. However, I think we need much more than just trying to blend, for example, hydrogen in existing infrastructure to try to, especially the amortized infrastructure. If we really want to scale up these new fuels that seem to be critical for energy transition, we would require new business models. We would require new contractual supply frameworks. We will require new, I would say, policy frameworks that take into account, again, localized circumstances. And for that, we will announce in September a new initiative, particularly focused on hydrogen, in the spirit of looking into beyond the debate between green and blue hydrogen, beyond the debate around which one is costlier than the other. We really want to make sure that hydrogen has, in the next few years, the contractual frameworks and the business models that it will require to really be scaled up.
And many of the world's leading oil and gas companies are now investing more than ever in renewables, especially the likes of BP, Shell, and many others. Do you think there's a risk as all of that money gets diverted towards renewables? Do you think there's a risk of underinvestment in conventional fuels like oil and gas? It can certainly feel that way. In recent months, you've had a very fast recovery in oil prices this year, and of course the very, very high spike in gas prices. Obviously, that's short term, but it gives you the feeling that we need to be careful about not underinvesting.
Yeah, it's all about feelings, right?
Yeah.
It's a very interesting question, Joe, because I think you're touching actually two deeper issues that the industry has been struggling with. Yes, we've all seen those numbers of increased investments by IOCs and some NOCs in renewable/low carbon technologies over the last few years, increasing to, if you do make the maths, around 14, 15, $16 billion per year. I think that has decreased last year because of the pandemic as well. That's still, I think, less than 1% of the capex of the industry in any case. But however, if I want to get back to the issue of where you put your investments as an oil or gas or energy company, integrated or not integrated, national or IOC or publicly listed independent, I think there are two issues that you are indirectly hinting at, I think. The first one is, and when you touched on the net zero backcasting forecast early on, I think it's a key issue, the uncertainty over long-term demand for oil and gas in investment planning. So all these companies have their own investment plan, in-house scenarios that they're using. And the second issue is, in a decreasing cash flow environment, in a squeezed margin environment, the relationship between the industry, between the oil and gas industry players and the pockets of capitals and the pockets of and the investors, in a way. So on the first one, on the uncertainty over long-term demand, how do you plan your investments in oil and gas, in infrastructure, in import and export infrastructure as well, if you have that uncertainty in investment planning? If you look at a very interesting graphic that we like to highlight now increasingly, if you look at how the analysts that have been plotting the future course of demand for primary energy have been publishing increasingly divergent outlooks. And that was even before the pandemic, by the way, and even before the politicians started to commit to net zero targets for greenhouse gas emissions. And the problem has been getting worse over the past decade. Today, the difference between the highest case and the lowest case for demand for oil, if I take the single largest source of primary energy, it's equivalent to half of the total market today, or roughly 55 million barrels a day of oil equivalents. 10 years ago, that difference between the highest case and low case, it did not exceed 30 million barrels a day. It was a third of the market. So as a company, of course, as I said, international oil companies and national oil companies alike traditionally use a set of scenarios internally and base their strategy on a few scenarios and stress tests their strategy and investment plan based on multiple scenarios. However, I think the uncertainty is definitely huge, and the communication of that uncertainty is also not helping. And the second issue that I wanted to raise here is that relationship between the oil and gas industry and investors. And there is a myth that investors have been abandoning the sector because they're so concerned about ESG risks and stranded assets. That's not entirely true, and I think we are getting at the bottom of how you allocate capital as an international oil company or as a national oil company. I think for infrastructure funds and investors, energy remains one of the preferred industry. It's the dramatically entrenched one. It was hit by 3 crises in 1 decade, and for the most part, it has been undervalued and with increasingly squeezed margins. I think for oil and gas, the pre-crisis expectations were already modest, but I think the real exodus of investors that happened, it was due to the sector providing over the last decade, before the pandemic, the lowest return to shareholders compared to other interesting sectors or sexier sectors like IT, real estate, etc. So there is definitely a risk of underinvestment. There is definitely a risk of difficulty to access pockets of capital that has been improved recently because you've seen investors coming back to the energy sector because the industry has been willing to reassure investors on its ability to pay back to shareholders, either through dividends or to return on capital. But I think these efforts have to continue going forward, in addition to what we have been talking about at the beginning of this discussion, methane emissions and carbon emissions abatement, that the industry has to be more serious on communicating on, indeed.
Well, thank you very much. And this has been another episode of In a Nutshell, the fortnightly podcast hosted by Natural Gas World, where we look at the global news and trends for the gas industry. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you.